Hi, I'm Nia Young, and welcome to my presentation concerning my research. Incredible, really, the potential benefits of real experiences in fantasy roleplay for trainee counsellors. The first question, perhaps, is why research roleplay? Well, despite some societal attitudes towards tabletop roleplay games, such as Dungeons and Dragons and so on, playing such games is also associated, according to previous literature, with lower feelings of meaningless in life, with elements of support for mental health, with supporting professional development and specifically skills development, and also increases in empathy. So while the tabletop roleplay games, TTRPGs, have a particular stereotype perhaps that goes with them in the societal sense, roleplay itself is widely acknowledged to be beneficial for personal development and professional development. And a number of professional training experiences will involve an element of role play for people to be able to learn specific skills and also put them into practice in a way that allows them to experience that skill in a more realistic setting. Daniau points out that role play has two primary facets to it. And we tend to have educational role play, which is goal-based. So role play that is designed to allow somebody to trial a specific skill and achieve a specific set of goals. And this is much more guided. But we also have transformative role play, and this is characterized by more freedom of exploration, less of a structured, scripted way of engaging with role play, and more of an element of creativity and being able to choose your specific actions within that role play. This sort of role play is also authentic. So within it, you're having an authentic experience. You are being yourself within it, perhaps, or taking on a role that is authentic to the experience that you want to have. You're allowed to make decisions within transformative role play. And in so doing, this sort of role play allows you to experience the consequences that go with the decisions that you make. So you don't know in advance what will happen once you've made a decision. The question might be, why is this kind of role play helpful? Well, two of the main reasons that it's identified as a helpful way to develop include trying out uncharacteristic behaviours. So the research suggests that playing tabletop roleplay games and that kind of transformative roleplay allows you to try a reaction to a situation that you might not normally engage with. So in the real world, you might not be particularly assertive or very aggressive. But within this roleplay, you have an opportunity to try out being those things, knowing that there's safety around that, knowing that it's a space where you can give it a go without real world consequences. But you do get some feedback around that, since there is a consequence within the game, within that role play for you. These TTRPGs are also a safe space for developing skills and relationships. When we think about things from an ethical standpoint, there are certain experiences that we wouldn't want to have for the first time in the real world, perhaps. When we think about training for skills such as surgery or experiences in very dangerous, risky settings, having an opportunity to trial those skills in a setting that is more controlled, is more safe, is distanced from those real world consequences can be very helpful. The next question might be, why specifically look at how these TTRPGs might be useful for trainee counsellors? We know that there are high rates of burnout for people in caring roles, that stress levels can be very high, and for trainee counsellors we know that stress, burnout and dropout rates are very high as a result of the nature of the course. Counselling is a caring profession. There's an element of stress around that, and counsellors do hold a lot of stress for their clients, for the stories that they're hearing. And managing those kinds of experiences and maintaining high levels of empathy can put trainee counsellors under stress. Alongside that, trainee counsellors also need a set of skills that might be helpfully developed by TTRPGs. So things such as relationship building, collaboration, Since TTRPGs are a group game, they may offer similar opportunities for development, as well as empathy skills, which previous research has suggested can be developed by these TTRPGs. So trainee counsellors seem like a group who might be able to benefit particularly from these kinds of games. So in this study, we worked with 6 students of a counselling course and delivered 4 sessions of a TTRPG that had been specifically designed to allow participants to develop key skills. These sessions began with an initial character building session. So pre-created characters were described to potential players, and the players then were able to choose the character that fitted who they wanted to be within the TTRPG best. It was decided to create initial characters for players because character building can be very broad and can take a long time. So we created templates that would speed up that process of getting involved with the game. Each of the 4 sessions had an opportunity for players to engage with a key counselling skill. And so these were empathy, conflict resolution, trust, and managing endings. At the end of the 4 sessions, we ran 2 focus groups in which players were asked to reflect on their experience of playing this TTRPG. These focus groups were transcribed, and those transcriptions were analysed using thematic analysis. And from that, 4 themes were identified. So the first theme was around using imagination and empathy in the experience of the game itself. The second theme revolved around ideas that players were raising around their own personal development. The third theme, and a theme that did come strongly through those focus groups, was around the impact of the TTRPG on general well-being. But another strand that came through those discussions was around what had made this a useful TTRPG and some tips around how to build TTRPGs that would be useful in future. So in the first theme, participants talked about the way that they were able to picture the world. So in the TTRPG, we have a storyteller who was one of the research team who described the world. And there were no props for this, there were no resources needed. It was a verbal description of the world, which was relayed online through a Teams meeting. But players really were able to imagine the world they were in, and they described picturing themselves involved in the activities. They also talked about elaborating on the world, so taking their character and building that character's backstory, imagining who that character was and really fleshing out who they were within that world, was work that they took on in their own time and didn't necessarily get shared with the rest of the players, but they had experienced that desire to really get under the skin of the character. What they also discussed, and which was maybe a surprise, especially for newer players, was that they had experienced real emotion in relation to this world. So they had become very fond of characters. They felt real emotion about their actions. So there were consequences, and then even though those actions and consequences happened in an imaginary world, they described experiencing real world emotion about that. Part of all of that imagination and empathy really centered around character relationships. And these were relationships not just between the characters within the TTRPG, but between the player and their own character as well. So players talked about times when their own self intruded on the character. So times when the character did something that they felt they wouldn't really do, and they had difficulty separating the two out. Difficulty doing a thing that was counter to their own personality, to their own self, even though it was true to the character that they had created. So even though players were able to step into a character's shoes to some extent, they weren't able to fully embody that character without their own self intruding, suggesting that there were limitations maybe on the empathy that they could show, the real full empathy for being in somebody else's situation. But another place that empathy really came through in those discussions was around how players talked about understanding other characters, how they were able to distinguish between the character and the real person that was playing that character for other players in the game, and drawing that distinction, recognizing that, okay, the character has done this thing, but that doesn't mean that the person playing the character is really going to do something like that or has that kind of attitude. So real empathy for other players and other players' experience as other characters, suggesting quite a complicated interaction of understandings of individuals and the characters they create and their own self within that. Players also discussed how their own development had been affected. One of the ways that they talked about this was in their actual experience, what they'd gained from the actual experience of playing the game. And player B1 noted that it does draw you in with real emotions of real situations. So it's incredible, really. And what struck me about this statement was this last contradiction, incredible, really. And that real things are credible, but the notion of something being both incredible and real really encapsulates much of the discussion around the experience of playing this game. So the actual experience was beneficial in that it gave players an opportunity to experience real emotions and real situations while also maintaining that sort of incredible fantasy world. As part of this, players talked about learning about the self. And player A2 noted that it's almost like you are being your most honest self when you are playing just a character. And again, we have this contradiction of being your truest self whilst pretending to be somebody else. But this theme around being able to explore who we are by being somebody else, by taking on a role, really came through a number of the discussions from the players. More explicitly, players also talked about developing skills in a range of key areas for counsellors and trainee counsellors. So ideas around problem solving to meet the situations being presented to them in the games, managing relationships with other players, listening to each other, collaboration. Each of these was directly mentioned by players as something they had developed. Players also directly referenced the impact of the TTRPG on their well-being. One of the key areas for this was around enjoyment. Player A2 described the weekly sessions as that little pocket of joy that they were looking forward to. Player B1, and like other players, noted the sort of childlike quality to playing this game, the excitement, the role play, the pretending to be somebody else, being a bit mischievous, really getting into a world of imagination that we associate quite strongly with childhood and being a child, and the enjoyment that came with being able to step into that kind of scenario again. Players also mentioned stress reduction associated with this, and talked about the escapism of it, that for a while they were in another world, they were focused on that world, they didn't have to be with the daily stresses, they were away from those. But player A3 also offered a caution around drawing any conclusions that were very specific to TTRPGs, in noting that, well, having time set aside for fun things is obviously good for your well-being. So recognizing that it might not specifically be a characteristic of TTRPGs on their own, this element of escapism and enjoyment and fun, but it could just be that having that time set aside to do something that you enjoy is on its own inherently good for your well-being. Finally, players also listed ideas for what made a useful TTRPG. One of the key things they noted about what was useful to them in the TTRPG that we had designed was the social element, that they had an opportunity to meet other people, to cooperate with them, build relationships. They also noted that given that this was designed specifically for trainee counsellors, that there might be a self-selecting bias perhaps in terms of who you're working with here, in that trainee counsellors may already be motivated to work with other people, be interested in other people, to have empathy and so on, making for maybe a more collaborative experience. but also meaning that we need care in designing the game to allow opportunities for not only defeating difficult characters, but also for exploration and problem solving and mediation and scenarios that involve more talking solutions rather than fighting solutions. The game design itself was important. Players valued having the character sheets, valued how simple the process of joining the game was. So all the rules were pared down, the character sheets were kept basic and easy to use. They also noted that other than those character sheets, there were no other resources really required, making it a really cheap and simple game to engage with, meaning there were no barriers in terms of expensive equipment. It was noted that support for new players was necessary, so helping new players to understand rules around dice rolling and how they were modified and so on. The sort of nuts and bolts of the game needed some time and care to introduce. Players also noted a number of potential risks with the game. These included the potential for embarrassment, again, particularly for new players who weren't certain how much role play was needed, how much they were expected to take on a character. So being clear from the start that you don't have to get dressed up or do voices or really even act if you don't want to, that you can play this by just imagining what your character would do and then describing it without having to inhabit the role. There was some worry about character behaviour and how that would reflect on the self. So some players did talk about feeling that their character was behaving badly, was behaving in ways that they didn't like and they didn't expect other people to like, but that they didn't want other people to think that that was who they were and think those kinds of behaviours were their own behaviours. And so that was a potential barrier to really inhabiting that character. And final risks were also noted about the kind of content in the story. So care was taken with the design of this TTRPG not to address or describe very vivid, distressing scenarios, but an awareness was raised that ideas and experiences can be very varied. So making sure that there's an introduction maybe and just care taken around the kinds of topics that are raised within the game. In conclusion, then, this research suggests support for the idea that TTRPGs offer escapism and stress reduction. And some parallels perhaps can be drawn with other areas of therapy, such as mindfulness, which allow people a space to be in the here and now and focused on a particular task and not maybe in the future, in the past, or thinking about other stresses. Players were able to recognise areas of personal development within the game, but they offered cautions around how much the benefits could be specifically related to TTRPGs rather than generally doing something fun. Having said that, more research perhaps on the role of fun in not just TTRPGs, but a range of activities is needed. Players described having a transformative experience in line with Daniau's work. They also highlighted that playing a character maybe is a key way of developing empathy, and that playing a character in itself requires empathy and ability to step into somebody else's shoes and see the world from somebody else's perspective. As a result, this research offers support for the notion that a carefully designed TTRPG can be a useful way to support trainee counsellors with their development and also reduction of stress, making it, since it's a cheap and cheerful way of doing those things, incredible, really. Thank you very much.